The massive white oak had been dead for 7 years when Paavo Järvinen started digging beneath it. Lightning had killed the tree in the summer of 1879, leaving a hollow trunk and a root system that spread 40 feet in every direction, like the skeleton of some buried giant. Other settlers had offered to help him clear the stump with dynamite and oxen. Järvinen refused. Instead, the Finnish immigrant spent his first American autumn excavating the earth between those roots, creating what his neighbors could only describe as a grave with furniture. "Finn's lost his mind," declared Horace Stockwell at the logging camp where most of the region's men worked through winter. Stockwell had been in Michigan for 15 years and considered himself an expert on surviving the brutal winters that swept down from Canada across Lake Superior. "You can't live under a dead tree. Roots will rot. Ground will flood. Man's digging his own burial pit and doesn't even know it." Agnes Whitfield, who ran the settlement's only boarding house and had seen many strange immigrant customs, watched Järvinen carry bed frames and a cast-iron stove down into his excavation. "Perhaps it's how they live in Finland," she offered charitably. "Though I can't imagine any civilized person choosing to sleep underground like a woodchuck when proper cabins exist." The mockery intensified when Järvinen moved his pregnant wife, Kirsty, into the underground dwelling in late October. Decent folk didn't raise families in holes. Children needed sunlight and fresh air, not root cellars dressed up as homes. Dr. Harold Marsh even visited to warn Kirsty about the dangers of underground living for her unborn child, citing concerns about dampness, bad air, and the psychological effects of living beneath the earth. Then, February 1887 brought the worst winter in Michigan's recorded history. Temperatures dropped to 51 degrees below zero. Snow accumulated to 17 feet in the deepest drifts. The logging camps shut down when men began freezing to death between bunkhouse and outhouse. 23 people died across the Upper Peninsula in a single week, their bodies not recovered until spring thaw revealed where they'd fallen. But beneath the dead oak's spreading roots, Paavo Järvinen's family slept warm. Their underground home maintained 54 degrees without any fire at all. When the Järvinens emerged after the killing cold had passed, carrying a healthy newborn daughter born during the worst of the storm, the settlement that had mocked them fell silent with something beyond surprise. What did this Finnish farmer understand about earth shelters and root structures that experienced Michigan settlers had completely missed? Paavo Järvinen had known cold that Americans couldn't imagine. He'd grown up in Ostrobothnia, the western coastal region of Finland, where winter temperatures regularly dropped below -40 and stayed there for weeks. His grandfather had taught him the old ways, survival knowledge passed down from generations who lived before modern heating, before insulated walls, before any technology except human ingenuity and desperate necessity. "Earth is warmth," his grandfather had said, speaking in Finnish that Järvinen could still hear decades later. "When sky turns killing cold, earth remembers summer. Go down, and the ground shares what it saved." The principle was simple physics, though Järvinen's grandfather had never used that word. Below the frost line, Earth maintained a constant temperature regardless of surface conditions. In Finland, that temperature was around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. In Michigan, slightly warmer at 50 to 55 degrees. Not comfortable by normal standards, but the difference between that baseline and the killing cold above meant the difference between life and death. Järvinen had spotted the dead oak during his first survey of the land he'd purchased with 3 years of logging wages. Most settlers saw a problem to be cleared. Järvinen saw a gift. The massive root system had created a natural excavation framework, roots spreading horizontally like ceiling joists waiting to support a roof. The hollow trunk could serve as a chimney, drawing smoke upward without requiring masonry skills Järvinen didn't possess. The tree's death meant the roots had stopped growing, eliminating the shifting and heaving that living root systems caused. "Why don't you build a cabin like everyone else?" asked his wife, Kirsti, when he explained his plan. She'd been skeptical since leaving Finland, worried that her husband's old country thinking would mark them as backward in their new home. "Americans have lumber. Americans have nails. We don't need to live like our great-grandparents." Järvinen had taken her hands, roughened by the voyage across the Atlantic and the hard months since their arrival. American lumber costs money. American nails cost money. This, he gestured at the dead oak and the earth beneath it, costs only work, and when winter comes, will be warm while Americans freeze in their expensive cabins. The excavation began in September 1886, as soon as the summer logging season released Järvinen from his camp obligations. He worked alone at first, unable to afford hired help and unwilling to ask neighbors who would only mock his methods. The soil beneath the oak was sandy loam, easy to dig but prone to collapse without proper shoring. Järvinen proceeded carefully, removing earth in layers and immediately reinforcing the walls with salvaged lumber from a collapsed barn he'd purchased for $2. The root system proved even more valuable than he'd anticipated. Roots as thick as a man's thigh spread across what would become his ceiling, natural beams that had supported tons of living wood for over a century. These roots interlocked with smaller branches that filled the spaces between them, creating a lattice that Järvinen reinforced with packed clay and straw. The resulting ceiling was stronger than anything he could have built from scratch, a collaboration between human engineering and a century of natural growth. By early October, the main chamber was complete, 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 7 feet deep at the center, where the hollow trunk rose toward the sky. Järvinen had dug alcoves into the walls for storage, reinforced the entrance with a timber frame, and installed a cast-iron stove whose pipe ran up through the hollow trunk, using the dead tree as a natural chimney. The stove had been his most expensive purchase, $23 from a merchant in Marquette who'd accepted partial payment in cordwood. Järvinen had agonized over the expense, but his grandfather's teachings included an important caveat. Earth shelter provided baseline warmth, but comfort required supplemental heat. The difference between 54 degrees and 68 degrees was the difference between survival and actually living. Horace Stockwell first visited the Järvinen dwelling on October 15th, driven by curiosity that his mockery couldn't fully suppress. What he found challenged everything he'd assumed about the strange Finnish immigrant in his underground home. The entrance was cleverly concealed, a wooden door set into the earthen bank at a 45-degree angle, protected by a small roof that would prevent snow from blocking access. Stockwell descended 8 earthen steps into a space that felt immediately different from the autumn chill above. The air was still and somehow gentle, carrying warmth that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. "It's warm in here," Stockwell admitted, surprised despite himself. "Warmer than my cabin, and you've got no fire burning." Järvinen nodded, accustomed to this reaction from the few visitors who'd bothered to investigate rather than simply ridicule. Earth holds summer heat until spring. Ground temperature stays same, 54 degrees, while air above goes up and down. My walls don't fight the cold like your walls. My walls ignore the cold because cold can't reach this deep. Stockwell examined the construction with the eye of a man who'd built his share of structures. The root-reinforced ceiling impressed him despite his skepticism. The interwoven pattern of thick and thin roots created a natural vault that distributed weight evenly across the span. Clay packed between the roots provided insulation and moisture barrier simultaneously. The walls showed similar craftsmanship. Järvinen had lined them with salvaged lumber, creating a smooth interior surface that prevented earth from crumbling into the living space. Behind the lumber, layers of birch bark provided waterproofing that channeled any seepage toward a gravel-filled drainage pit in the corner. The floor was packed clay covered with woven rush mats, surprisingly comfortable underfoot and easy to keep clean. A wooden shelf held provisions that would have spoiled quickly in a surface cabin's temperature fluctuations. Root vegetables, smoked fish, and preserved berries sat alongside everyday supplies, the stable underground temperature serving as a natural refrigerator that extended food preservation far beyond what surface storage allowed. "What happens when those roots rot?" Stockwell asked, identifying what he considered the fatal flaw in Järvinen's design. "Dead wood doesn't last. Give it 5 years and this ceiling will collapse on your family's heads." "Roots underground rot slow," Järvinen explained. "No air, no sun, no quick decay. These roots lasted 100 years growing. They'll last 100 years more dying. My grandchildren will worry about ceiling, not me." The claim seemed fantastic, but Järvinen spoke with the quiet confidence of inherited knowledge rather than hopeful speculation. Stockwell left the underground dwelling troubled by questions he couldn't answer, and unwilling to admit that the Finnish immigrant might understand something he didn't. Kirsti Järvinen had initially resisted moving into the underground home, her reservations reflecting both practical concerns and social anxieties. Living beneath the earth felt like regression, a return to conditions her family had escaped generations ago. She worried about what the American neighbors would think, about how her children would be perceived, about whether underground living would mark them permanently as outsiders in their new country. Her concerns shifted during the first November cold snap, when temperatures dropped to 15 below zero and stayed there for 6 days. The Järvinen's underground home maintained its steady 54-degree baseline, requiring only small fires in the cast-iron stove to reach comfortable temperatures. Meanwhile, reports filtered through the settlement of above-ground cabins where water froze in buckets 10 feet from roaring fireplaces, where families huddled together under every blanket they owned and still shivered through sleepless nights. "I understand now," Kirsti told her husband on the 4th night of the cold snap. They sat in their underground home wearing light wool rather than the heavy furs that surface dwellers required. Their wood consumption was perhaps a quarter of what their neighbors burned. The baby growing in her belly would be born into warmth rather than desperate cold. "Your grandfather was right. Earth remembers summer." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through November and December, defying Dr. Marsh's warnings about underground living. The stable temperature eliminated the thermal shocks that stressed pregnant women in above-ground homes, where moving from bed to floor might mean a 30-degree temperature change. The humidity remained constant, preventing the respiratory problems that dry cabin air caused. Kirsti felt healthier than she had during her previous pregnancy in Finland, where their conventional farmhouse had required constant fire tending to maintain survivable conditions. Dr. Marsh visited again in early January, ostensibly to check on Kirsti's condition, but clearly curious about the underground dwelling that had become a topic of settlement gossip. What he found forced him to reconsider his medical objections. "The air quality is better than I expected," Marsh admitted, using his stethoscope to check Kirsti's breathing. "No dampness in the lungs. Skin condition is good. The child seems healthy and well-positioned. He paused, struggling with the professional humility required to acknowledge error. I may have been premature in my concerns. The environment seems conducive to health. Yervinen accepted the partial apology without comment. He'd learned that Americans required time to accept ideas that contradicted their assumptions, and that pushing too hard only increased resistance. The Earth shelter would prove itself through performance, not argument. The Great Freeze of 1887 began on February 2nd with a pressure drop that experienced settlers recognized as dangerous. Barometric readings at the Marquette weather station fell faster than any previously recorded, and the temperature followed as if racing the mercury to the bottom of the scale. By midnight on February 3rd, the temperature had reached 31 degrees below zero. By dawn on February 4th, it had fallen to 43 below. The cold continued deepening through the day, reaching 51 degrees below zero on the morning of February 5th, a temperature so extreme that exposed flesh froze in under 60 seconds, and steel tools shattered like glass when struck. The logging camps shut down immediately. Men who ventured outside for any reason risked death within minutes if they couldn't find shelter. The journey from bunkhouse to outhouse, perhaps 40 feet, became a calculation of survival odds. Several men chose to relieve themselves indoors rather than risk the crossing, a decision that violated every standard of decency, but acknowledged the reality that decency meant nothing to the frozen dead. Settlement residents fared little better. Above-ground cabins, even those well-constructed with double walls and tight chinking, couldn't maintain survivable temperatures when the differential between inside and outside exceeded 100 degrees. Fireplaces designed for normal winters couldn't produce enough heat to overcome conduction losses through walls, floors, and roofs. Families burned furniture, fence rails, and finally, structural lumber, feeding their fires with pieces of their own homes in desperate attempts to stay alive. Agnes Whitfield's boarding house, the largest and supposedly best-constructed building in the settlement, maintained indoor temperatures of approximately 18 degrees Fahrenheit, despite 3 fireplaces burning continuously. Boarders slept fully clothed under every available blanket, waking every 2 hours to add wood to fires that consumed fuel faster than anyone had thought possible. 2 elderly boarders developed frostbite on their extremities despite never leaving the building. One, a retired logger named Erickson, would lose 3 toes to gangrene that spring. Horace Stockwell's cabin fared worse. His wall chinking, adequate for normal winters, cracked and separated in the extreme cold, admitting drafts that no amount of fire could overcome. Stockwell, his wife, and their 3 children retreated to the area immediately surrounding their fireplace, abandoning the rest of their home to cold that formed ice on interior walls. They survived barely by burning their beds, their chairs, and finally their dining table, reducing their possessions to ashes to buy a few more hours of marginal warmth. 7 settlement residents died during the first week of the Great Freeze. 14 more died during the second week, when fuel supplies exhausted and temperatures remained below -30. The deaths included 3 children, 2 elderly settlers, and a young mother who'd given birth just days before the cold arrived. Her infant survived only because neighbors took the child in after discovering the mother's frozen body. Beneath the dead oak's spreading roots, the Yervinen family experienced a different reality entirely. The earth shelter maintained its 54-degree baseline, regardless of surface conditions. When outside temperatures reached 51 below zero, the temperature 6 feet underground remained exactly as it had been in October, in November, in December. The Earth's thermal mass was so enormous that surface conditions couldn't affect it on any timescale relevant to human survival. The frost line crept downward, reaching perhaps 5 feet by the depth of the freeze, but Järvinen had dug below 7 feet, maintaining a buffer that the cold couldn't penetrate. The cast-iron stove, burning wood at a modest rate that would have seemed pathetically inadequate in any above-ground structure, raised the interior temperature to 62 degrees. The Järvinens wore wool sweaters rather than fur coats. They slept under blankets rather than huddled masses of every fabric they owned. They consumed perhaps 1/5 the firewood that above-ground dwellings required, their supply lasting easily through a crisis that exhausted their neighbors' reserves. Kirsty went into labor on February 9th, the 7th day of the Great Freeze, when surface temperatures stood at 44 degrees below zero. In any above-ground dwelling, childbirth under such conditions would have been life-threatening for both mother and infant. The physical demands of labor, combined with cold stress and inadequate heating, had killed women in better circumstances than this winter offered. In the underground shelter, Kirsty labored in warmth that allowed her body to function normally. Paavo boiled water on the cast-iron stove, maintained clean cloths at comfortable temperatures, and caught his daughter when she emerged into a world that, in this small underground space, was warm enough to welcome her. They named her Aino, after Paavo's grandmother, who had taught his grandfather the earth shelter techniques now saving their lives. The infant's first cries echoed off root-reinforced walls that had protected families for generations in the old country and now protected a new generation in the new world. The settlement learned of the Järvinen family's survival on February 17th, when temperatures finally rose above -20 and cautious travel became possible. Horace Stockwell was among the first to check on neighbors, dreading what he expected to find at the underground dwelling that had seemed so inadequate for winter survival. What he found instead left him speechless. Paavo Järvinen emerged from his earth shelter carrying a healthy, week-old infant, followed by Kirsty, who walked without the shuffling weakness that characterized everyone else who'd survived the freeze. They looked rested. They looked warm. They looked like people who'd experienced a difficult week rather than a near-death ordeal. "How?" Stockwell managed, the single word carrying more weight than any speech he might have prepared. Järvinen invited him inside, and Stockwell descended into the underground dwelling that had been the subject of so much mockery. The warmth that greeted him felt like an accusation. The comfortable temperature, the adequate wood supply, the simple evidence of normal life continuing while the surface world froze, all of it indicted the assumptions that had made Stockwell so certain of Järvinen's foolishness. "Earth remembers summer." Järvinen repeated the phrase his grandfather had taught him. "Ground temperature stays same. Cold cannot reach down far enough to take the warmth away. Americans build up toward sky. Sky is where cold lives. We build down toward earth. Earth is where warmth lives." The explanation was simple enough for a child to understand, yet Stockwell and everyone else in the settlement had dismissed it as immigrant foolishness. They'd trusted their lumber, their nails, their American construction methods, and those methods had failed catastrophically when truly tested. Järvinen had trusted knowledge that predated America by centuries, and that knowledge had kept his family alive. News of the Järvinen family's survival spread through the devastated settlement with the speed of desperate hope. 23 dead and dozens injured, yet one family had not merely survived, but thrived, giving birth to a healthy child during the worst of the freeze. The contrast demanded explanation, and Järvinen found himself hosting a steady stream of visitors who descended into his earth shelter to understand what they dismissed as madness. The spring of 1887 brought reconstruction, reassessment, and a fundamental shift in how the settlement approached winter preparation. The Great Freeze had killed too many to ignore, damaged too much to dismiss as anomaly. Whatever was rebuilt needed to survive conditions that had proven lethal to conventional construction. Järvinen became, reluctantly, a teacher. His English had improved through necessity, and his patient explanations found receptive audiences among survivors who'd watched neighbors freeze in supposedly adequate homes. He taught the principles his grandfather had taught him: depth below frost line, thermal mass of surrounding earth, the critical importance of drainage to prevent the moisture problems that could make underground living dangerous. Roots make good ceiling if tree is dead long enough, he explained to a group of settlers planning their own earth shelters. Living roots move, push, change. Dead roots stay still. But dead roots that died recently still have rot inside, need roots dead many years, dried out, stable. Oak is best. Pine rots too fast. Maple works, but not as strong. The technical details mattered because mistakes underground could be fatal. Järvinen had seen earth shelters collapse in Finland, had known families buried by poorly shored ceilings or drowned by inadequate drainage. The techniques that worked required precision that his American students sometimes resented, but eventually accepted. 6 families began earth shelter construction that spring, following specifications Järvinen provided based on their available sites and resources. Not all had convenient dead oaks to build beneath, requiring alternative approaches that Järvinen adapted from Finnish techniques. Some dug into hillsides, using the earth itself as walls and roof. Others excavated flat ground and constructed timber-reinforced chambers covered with sod. All achieved the critical depth that placed living quarters below the frost line, where earth temperature remained stable. The construction process revealed skills that American settlers had never needed to develop. Shoring techniques prevented collapse during excavation. Drainage calculations ensured water would flow away from living spaces rather than accumulating in them. Ventilation design provided fresh air without sacrificing the thermal stability that made underground living worthwhile. Järvinen taught each skill patiently, demonstrating techniques his grandfather had shown him decades ago in Finland. He explained how to read soil composition, identifying sand that drained well, but required more shoring versus clay, that held its shape, but could become waterlogged. He showed how to position entrances to prevent wind-driven snow from blocking access, while still allowing natural light to reach interior spaces. The women learned alongside the men, Kirsty teaching what she'd observed about underground housekeeping. Moisture management required different approaches than surface dwelling. Cooking produced steam that needed ventilation routes. Clothing storage demanded attention to prevent mildew in spaces where air circulation was limited. The accumulated knowledge of one winter's underground living became curriculum for families who would face their first subterranean experience the following year. Horace Stockwell converted his existing cabin into a hybrid structure, excavating a sleeping chamber beneath his floor that could serve as refuge during extreme cold. The work cost him 3 weeks of spring labor, but the memory of huddled desperation while his family froze motivated efforts that mere efficiency never could. By the following winter, Stockwell's family could retreat underground when temperatures dropped below tolerance, maintaining survival conditions while surface structures served only as entryways. The technique spread beyond the immediate settlement, through networks of correspondence and migration that carried survival knowledge across the Upper Peninsula and into neighboring territories. Finnish immigrant communities proved most receptive, recognizing in Järvinen's methods the traditional knowledge their own families had carried from the old country. But American settlers also adopted earth shelter principles after the Great Freeze demonstrated the inadequacy of conventional construction. Regional building surveys conducted in 1892 documented the technique's spread and effectiveness. Of 156 homesteads surveyed across the Upper Peninsula, 67 included some form of underground living space, either as primary dwelling or emergency refuge. Cold-related mortality in the surveyed area had dropped by 81% compared to pre-1887 rates, a reduction attributable primarily to earth shelter adoption. Insurance companies began recognizing the survival advantages of underground construction, offering reduced premiums for homesteads that included earth shelter components. The actuarial logic was straightforward. Families with underground refuges filed fewer death claims during severe winters, making them better insurance risks. The premium differential, approximately 20% for qualifying structures, provided financial incentive beyond mere survival. Järvinen's original earth shelter beneath the dead oak remained occupied until 1923, when his daughter Aino, the child born during the Great Freeze, finally moved into a modern house with central heating. The underground home had served 3 generations without major repair, its root-reinforced ceiling intact after 36 years of continuous use. When Aino sealed the entrance, she left the interior furnished as a historical artifact, preserved against some future need that she hoped would never come. Modern geotechnical research conducted by Michigan Technological University in 1998 confirmed the thermal principles underlying Järvinen's construction. Ground temperature at 7-foot depth in the Upper Peninsula remains stable between 52 and 56 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface conditions that range from 90 degrees in summer to negative 50 degrees in extreme winters. This 140-degree surface variation produces less than 4 degrees of change at shelter depth, demonstrating the remarkable thermal stability that Earth provides. Archaeological surveys of abandoned Upper Peninsula homesteads have documented numerous earth shelters, many still structurally sound after a century or more. The root-reinforced examples prove particularly durable, their organic ceilings having dried to stability rather than rotted to collapse as skeptics predicted. These structures stand as physical evidence that traditional knowledge, properly applied, can outperform modern methods under conditions that test both to failure. The Great Freeze of 1887 remains one of the deadliest weather events in Michigan history, its toll of lives a testament to the gap between settler confidence and winter reality. But in one small settlement, the death toll was lower than it might have been, because a Finnish immigrant remembered what his grandfather knew. When winter comes to kill, the earth itself offers shelter to those wise enough to seek it. Järvinen's underground home beneath the dead oak hadn't just challenged American building assumptions. It had proven that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive foolishness often revealed not their ignorance, but ours.